In the early 2000s, following the immense success of the original Scream trilogy, Dimension Films announced a brand new collaboration between director Wes Craven and writer Kevin Williamson, which was touted to be a reinvention of the werewolf subgenre. However, the studio was unhappy with the initial product as they wanted it to be more of a Scream movie but with werewolves, and so it sat in development hell for 2.5 years while undergoing multiple reshoots and several cast changes, until the finished film was neither a werewolf movie that could live up to its promise, or a slasher whodunit that could even begin to emulate the massive appeal of the Ghostface-centric franchise. So in this video, we're going to re-examine the mostly never seen and often largely forgotten lycanthropic misadventure to find out exactly who killed who in Wes Craven's Cursed. What is up, Scream team? Zach Cherry here, and if you're obsessed with horror movies and the unsolved murders within them, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and set those bell notifications to all. That way, you can stay up to date with all my latest content. Unlike the Scream movies, Cursed isn't a particularly cerebral offering, so you can expect this to be more so a general recap rather than a deep dive. All the same, I would love for you to toss this video a thumbs up and maybe in the comments down below to, I don't know, let me know what you think about Cursed. Let's get into it. Set in Hollywood and the surrounding Los Angeles area, the movie begins at Santa Monica Pier, where we're introduced to Jenny and Becky, who are basically just bland stock characters whose only real defining trait is that they each have the exact same hairstyle. Concerned that the guy she's been seeing isn't actually interested in her, Becky gets her fortune read by Zella, played by Portia de Rossi from Scream 2, who appears to be this movie's answer to Crazy Ralph from Friday the 13th.
It's got a death curse!
She tells both Becky and Jenny that she only sees blood in their future and leaves them with a very vague and unhelpful warning that they should beware the moon. In true horror genre fashion, Jenny illogically disappears, abandoning Becky at the pier, where she is then left to drive home alone. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, we're introduced to recently orphaned siblings Jimmy and Ellie Myers as they unsuccessfully try to woo their romantic interests. Jimmy with a classmate named Brooke, who is dating the school's homophobic wrestling captain Bo, and then Ellie with Jake, who turns down her romantic invitation because of commitment issues. Jake instead has an endless love for the Universal classic monsters, the Wolfman in particular, and is busy preparing for the opening of Tinsel, a movie-themed nightclub which is holding a PR event that Ellie will be attending through her job as a producer on the Craig Kilborn show. On their way home along Mulholland Drive with their dog Zipper, Jimmy and Ellie get into a collision with Becky, driving home from the pier, after an animal that appears to be a werewolf jumps up on their windshield. Becky's car tumbles down the side of the road, and when Jimmy and Ellie try to get her unstuck, the werewolf smashes through the driver's side window, pulling Becky out as Jimmy and Ellie try to save her. They lose her in the ensuing struggle, but as they head back to the road to meet the paramedics, Becky's bisected body is hurled at them after having been chomped in half. With the siblings having been bitten and scratched by the werewolf during the altercation, Zipper now senses the curse in Jimmy, and after growling at him, bites his finger, which also transfers the curse into Zipper. The police and paramedics brush off the attack as being a mountain lion or bear, but Jimmy is convinced that what he saw was a werewolf and does his own research online. That night, Ellie has a dream in which Jake comes to visit her to apologize for blowing her off earlier, but she wolfs out in the process and takes a giant bite out of his neck before waking up. Following that, Jimmy and Ellie begin to exhibit strange behavior, like waking up in the bushes naked, catching flies with their hands, and having a sudden appetite for copious amounts of meat. They also each inherit a strange mark on their right palm, which forms a pentagram, signifying that they now possess the curse of the werewolf. The next few scenes are pretty pointless and just a retread of what was already established previously, although we are introduced to Ellie's assistant Kyle, as well as Joni, a bitchy publicist played by Judy Greer, whose campy performance is literally the only thing that ever gets me through this slog of a movie. It's also here where we find out that she and Jake once had a fling, and she warns Ellie to watch out for him, since he's a notorious womanizer who will just break her heart in the end. Later that night at a bougie rooftop costume party, Joni arranges a pre-interview with Scott Baio, played by himself, so that Ellie can prepare for his guest appearance on the Craig Kilborn show. I'll just mention this now because this storyline takes up far too much of the movie's runtime, but at one point the plan was that Scott Baio was going to be one of the two werewolves, which would not only explain Joni's weird obsession with him, but also act as a bad joke to reference the television sitcom Joni Loves Chachi, in which Bayo was a star. Ellie also has another run-in with Jake, who tries to explain to her that he's changed from his philandering ways, although she isn't convinced after she catches him flirting with several women, one of them being Jenny, who's dressed up as a sexy leopard. It's here where we find out that Jake was the guy who was seeing Becky, to which he explains that he's taken himself off the market to pursue a relationship with Ellie. Jenny leaves the party but is attacked by the werewolf in the parking garage and eventually killed when she tries to flee in the elevator. The next day, the powers of the werewolf take an even greater effect on the siblings as they sexify themselves by wearing revealing clothes and using product in their hair. At school, Jimmy shows off to Brooke by challenging Bo to a wrestling match where the two exchange some very problematic terms that haven't aged particularly well in the past 17 years. Meanwhile, Ellie gets a taste of blood after Craig Kilborn cuts his finger on a soda can, which causes her to have a bit of a meltdown when she's unable to control her urges. Jimmy pays a visit to Jake to try and get some male role model advice to no avail, and is later on confronted by Bo, who shows up at his house where he comes out to him as gay, believing that Jimmy is gay too. They get attacked by Zipper, who has now morphed into a were-dog, and take off in Bo's car, where Jimmy reveals to him that he and his sister have been cursed. Meanwhile, Ellie sees a news report where the names of the werewolf victims are released, which clues her into the fact that they both knew Jake, making him a likely suspect in their murders. She's then confronted by Jake outside of her work, where she discovers that he's also been cursed. However, he gets very aggressive with her as he tries to explain why everything has been happening, so she fights him off before driving away. On her way home, she tries to warn Jimmy about Jake, but he and Bo have already arrived at Tinsel to look for her there. She ends up coming to them at the party instead, where they all find themselves in a maze of mirrors, with Jake confessing that he was born with the werewolf curse and didn't actually murder the women as he's learned how to control his powers. Suddenly, they're attacked by the werewolf, who begins chasing after them, causing them all to separate. Bo gets knocked out in the process, but the werewolf follows Ellie out of the maze, where they begin killing several guests at the party. Don't ask me how many, this is not a kill count per se, but let's just say that there is no definitive number, as we see several people getting swiped dead and thrown across the room, with a few random dead bodies lying around afterwards. Most of the guests do make their way out though, and as the security gate closes behind them, Ellie Indiana Joneses her way underneath it in order to rescue Jimmy, who's been left inside with the beast. She manages to find him okay, but they also run into Kyle, who's now acting needlessly suspicious. However, he's quickly taken out when they turn their back on him for a moment, and after frantically trying to find a way out, they're confronted by Joni, who reveals herself to bear the curse as well. She explains that she got it from Jake months earlier after getting a little too rough during sex, but also that he broke up with her, so she decided that if she couldn't have him, no other woman would. A fight ensues where Jake shows up to try and stop Joni, but after telling her that she'll have to kill him in order to get to Ellie, thus losing her werewolf curse, she elects instead to knock him out. Joni transforms back into the wolf in order to kill the siblings, but hides when the police show up, who've been called to the scene after reports that the club had come under siege by a wild animal. Ellie lures Joni out into the open by hurling insults and playing off of her vanity, which causes the police to open fire on her, leaving her seemingly dead. Jimmy says that the werewolf can't be killed unless the head is separated from the body, but after Joni delivers a very Scream-esque one last scare, an officer shoots her brains out onto the floor. Ellie and Jimmy find Bo, who's still alive, but Jake is mysteriously missing, and when animal control shows up to take away the werewolf, it has already reverted back to Joni's human form. After a long night, the siblings return home, where after believing the whole ordeal to be over, discover that they still have the curse. Jake shows up and tells Ellie not to fight it, as her being a werewolf is the only way they can be together. However, it's not the life she wants, so she breaks up with him instead. Jake reminds her that the only way the curse can be broken is if he were to die, and he makes it clear that he has no intention of letting that happen anytime soon. He then tries to kill Jimmy, declaring that there can only be one alpha, but after getting the upper hand on him by stabbing him with a silver pie knife, they're able to decapitate him with a shovel, causing his body to combust into flames. With the siblings and their dog Zipper now uncursed, Jimmy takes off to hang out with Brooke, who he is apparently now dating, leaving Ellie at home to clean up the mess all by herself. So now that you're more or less caught up to speed with the movie, let's try to figure out who out of Jake and Joni committed each murder. First First up is Becky, who is pulled out of her car and ripped in half. Although Joni makes a vague confession to killing the women who Jake had been romantically linked to, and Jake himself denies being involved in the murders, we should know with 100% certainty that this werewolf had to be Jake. The reason for that is that this was the same werewolf that attacked Jimmy and Ellie, transferring the curse onto them. Obviously, had Joni been the one to pass along the curse, they would have already been cured from it after she died at the club, as the werewolf line would have been severed with her. But since they are still werewolves up until the final confrontation with Jake, it pretty much guarantees that this was him. Further to that, Joni already stated that she never thought of Ellie as a threat and therefore wouldn't have gone after her. And seeing as how Jake had already moved on from Becky, Joni would have no reason to go after her either. If anything, leaving Becky alive would probably be more beneficial for Joni, as it would just create more drama for Jake if Becky and Ellie were to ever find out about each other. I will point out the highly unlikely coincidence of not only the two cars passing by the werewolf at the same time, but also the fact that Becky, of all people, would be the one to get into a collision with Ellie and Jimmy, just given all of their connections to Jake. But as we can see during this scene, Jake actually targets Ellie's car, which would make sense just given the fact that he wanted to pass the curse along to her. This was probably a result of the studio demanding multiple rewrites and Kevin Williamson just not giving a shit about logic at that point, but it does stand to reason that Jake would have killed Becky in the moment, as he couldn't have foreseen her ever being involved in the scenario and wanted to make sure that she was dead so Ellie would never find out that he was dating both of them at the same time. As for Jake's surprise at discovering Joni was the other werewolf, this is either another lapse in continuity or Jake himself is feigning ignorance, since as a werewolf who's had the curse his entire life, he would be able to easily sniff out other werewolves. I should also point out that Jake being the one to kill Becky does somewhat contradict Zella's prophecies early on, as she tells Becky that it isn't the ex-boyfriend she should fear, but rather the beast. Obviously, that doesn't account for the possibility that Zella is bad at what she does or is just misinterpreting her divine messages, but this can also be attributed to the rewrites, as Jake turning out to be the main villain of the movie was a very last-minute modification to the script. When it comes to Jenny's death, I'm gonna take Joni's confession at face value and reason that she would have been the werewolf to kill her. I think the strongest case for this is the fact that Jake is still upstairs at the party when Ellie leaves by taking the elevator down to the parking garage. Jenny follows behind her shortly thereafter in another elevator, but as we can see from the werewolf's POV, they're already downstairs by the time Ellie gets there. Of course, this doesn't account for the fact that as a werewolf, Jake would have advanced speed and could race down the stairwell to get to the parking garage before either of the women, but to suggest that he would be the one to kill Jenny completely contradicts Joni's confession. Also, as we can see during this shot, the werewolf doesn't actually go after Ellie, which checks out with what Joni says later on about never considering her to be a threat. But the fact that Joni would specifically single out Jenny is indicative of her being jealous of Jake flirting with her minutes earlier. She even stares daggers at Jenny during this scene and then conveniently excuses herself moments later. I do at least want to credit this movie for hiding Joni's lycanthropy, as every time she does show up on screen, her right hand is concealed by either a glove or a cell phone, so we never actually get to see the mark of the werewolf until she's revealed. Now, just to streamline the rest, since this is a relatively bloodless movie, Beau's attack, along with the indeterminable number of casualties at the club, which does include Kyle, would all have to be the handiwork of Joni. This is initially obvious by the fact that Jake is visibly in the scene when the werewolf first attacks, but also later on when Jake reappears and is still wearing the same clothing. Joni, on the other hand, is first seen at the club wearing a black outfit, which is conspicuously missing the next time she shows up. As is pretty common with most werewolf lore, any clothing worn by the human before their transformation into the wolf will usually be shredded in the process, thus leaving them nude when they transform back. This explains why Joni is later on seen wearing the purple dress, which she would have lifted off of one of the mannequins in order to quickly cover herself up. So with the 3 character deaths plus the indeterminable number of security personnel and guests at the club, we can rule that Jake killed Becky, while Joni killed everyone else. With the police shooting Joni and Jimmy and Ellie decapitating Jake, that's basically everything you need to know about Who Killed Who and Cursed, a movie that's production definitely lived up to its name. I want to thank my Patreon supporter Tevin Jackson. I know the pool is very limited for horror movies with multiple killers, but I do want to make more of these Who Killed Who videos, and I definitely have some ideas for other movies to cover. In the meantime, you can check out the episodes I did for John Carpenter's The Thing, as well as every entry in the entire Scream franchise. Until then, I've been Zach Cherry, and I'll be right back.